Is tell us your name and spell your last name for us.
Okay. Full name is Charles William Chandler, Chandler.
Okay. Now, can you tell us where you were when the war started, and did you think it was going to catch up with you, so to speak?
When the war started, of course, it was on a Sunday. I was back in Indiana, back in Evansville. And a group of us had gone for a walk on a Sunday afternoon, and we came back and someone turned on the radio, and I think we were listening to the Coca-Cola Hour or something like that, and then they broke into it and gave the announcement, and we all sat there sort of dumbfounded, and then probably made some stupid remarks about, this won't last long and so forth. But and then the following day, when we were in high school, there was an assembly, and the entire student body were in the auditorium, and we listened to President Roosevelt's speech, and so that really brought it home.
Roosevelt was a pretty impressive speaker, I understand.
Oh, yes.
How did you feel about that speech?
Well, a little scared and really didn't know what was going on. Let's see, at that point my brother was still in college, but he later went into service.
So what changes, if any, occurred in your life before you entered the service? What things changed in Evansville?
Well, for one thing, one plant that had been producing automobiles, one of Chrysler's plants, became a plant that produced ammunition, just the cartridge cases. And then just below the high school where we attended, they built a shipyard, and they were making LSTs. So, plus the fact, of course, that there was rationing. And I know that became apparent to me because at the time I had a Saturday job and I was selling women's shoes. And so they had to have their little stamp so that they could buy the shoes. So things were tightened down. I remember my mother doing some replanning as far as what we were going to be eating, because things were not available due to you had to have this stamp or that stamp and so on.
Well, how'd you get involved with the military then?
I graduated from high school in 1943, the same time that Virginia did, and I think it was probably about 2 weeks later, I received one of those famous greetings from the President of the United States. So I reported, I think it was on the 19th of June, with a number of other people, had my physical, and was sworn into the Navy. So I was one of those who had their name called. And
actually drafted into the Navy?
I was drafted, and at that time you had a choice. You could go Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and there was no Air Force at that time per se. And so I happened to choose the Navy, and then about 2 weeks later, we were on our way to Great Lakes.
Okay, so tell me, why the Navy?
You know, I've been trying to figure that one out. I think part of it may have been the fact that, oddly enough, I didn't like the idea of digging ditches and sleeping in foxholes, which I later did anyway. But it just seemed to me that there was more variety. I had more things to choose from. I knew that once I was in boot camp, they would be trying to classify us and put us into different trades. So that was why I took that choice.
And so now the next question is, how'd you wind up as a pharmacist, mate?
Well, I mentioned the test, and on that, when we were brought in after they had scored the tests and so forth, I was told that I could either be a radio man or I could go to corps school. Well, what I knew about radio was not other than you turn it on, you turn it off. And I really didn't know a lot more about medicine, but I thought, well, that has a nice sound to it, and so I chose that.
Well, tell me a little bit about the medical training you received, and how well prepared you thought you were before you went overseas. And the other question is, how did you wind up in the corpsman attached to the Marine Corps?
Well, all right. We went to the hospital corps school at Great Lakes, and just a little side note on that. At that time, the armed forces were segregated, and I think that we were into probably about halfway through our corpsman's training. We had classes in nursing, classes in pharmacopoeia, various things of that type, anatomy, physiology. They were trying to give us a general description, and we also had a very large book which was called the Corpsman Handbook. It was about the size of a good-sized dictionary. And but at that time, one day something happened onto our part of our schedule, and we were in this room, and we suddenly noticed that all of the people in here are of a different color than we are, and there were blacks. Use the term African American, whichever they want, but they were in there, and they were actually going to school too. We had no idea that they were there. And the next time that I saw them was the day that we graduated, because they seated us by name, and so we all went through the graduation ceremony together. As far as the training was concerned there, basically I think about the only thing that I did learn there, you might say, that would be useful later on, was how to give people shots. And one of the things that corpsmen do most of the time. But it was general nursing. I think that you might say that in a sense we seemed to be prepared to be like nurses' aides. So we didn't, but there was a difference in that. Later, when I had some service attached to an Army hospital, the corpsmen or the medics could not give shots at that time, which we could do. So that was one of the main differences there. Well, when I graduated from the corps school, I was sent to Florida, to Jacksonville, Florida, to the Naval Air Station Hospital. And I was, oddly enough, nothing to do with surgery, but I served on a psychiatric ward. So I had an opportunity to see what that was like. And that was where, as I say, I was playing football and wound up with a name that some people to this day don't know me by any other name. The end that was playing next to me was a New York Yankee fan. And in 1943, the New York Yankees had a pitcher by the name of Spurgeon Spud Chandler. So he said, you know, I think I'm going to call you Spud. Well, that's where it came from. But I was only there for, I think, no more than 6 weeks. And one day, I was working on the ward, and I heard the phone ring, and somebody said, hey, Chandler, you wasn't on the phone. So I went back, picked up the phone, and the words that I heard, which still remain with me today, Chandler, you're going to look great in green. That was my first notice that I had been volunteered. And I think there were about 14 or 15 of us who were detached from the hospital in various wards that they worked on. And then the following day, while we were aboard the train, we went north to Camp Lejeune. And that was when I became a Marine.
So tell me how you felt about going from being a Navy corpsman to being a corpsman attached to the Marine Corps.
Well, to begin with, again, we had literally no idea what we were going to be going into. But as soon as we arrived, we sort of got the message that we were no longer Navy, because one of the first things they did was to march us down to a large Quonset hut and told us to start picking out Marine uniforms. And then we were to take our Navy uniforms off, put them into our sea bags, put a tag on that, and send it home, because we were not going to be wearing blues anymore after that. But it was, as I say in the beginning, it was just sort of what's going on here time. And then the schooling there was more of doing things in the field. How to make sure that we'll say that if you had a campsite, that everything was the way that it was supposed to be. We were also given more training as to taking care of serious wounds. And so, plus the fact that many people don't know this, but the Japanese had a nasty habit of shooting corpsmen, because as the saying used to go, one corpsman is worth 6 wounded Marines, because they figured that one corpsman could make sure that 6 wounded Marines would get back and then possibly be able to return to duty. But as I say, the Japanese had a nasty habit of shooting at the corpsmen, which is why we did not wear the Red Cross brassard, or like the Army, we didn't have a nice white circle on our helmets with a red cross in the middle of it, and also why they took us to the rifle range and we learned how to fire the M1 and the carbine, and had instructions on the firing of a machine gun and so forth. In other words, so that we would be able to defend ourselves. But as time went on, of course, as I say, it was basically just teaching us the various things that you needed to have. It was more or less like a second boot camp outside of the classroom, because we had a Marine DI who made sure that we learned how to march correctly. The first thing was trying to understand his counting of cadence, which was sort of a hop, plop, throp, and the rear march was rip, ho. So he did this about twice, and we were all marching along, and he finally spoke in very clear and English, plus a few words that are not usually used in polite society, and we got the message.
So a little change in climate between the Navy hospital and the Marine base?
Yes. We were, of course, in this situation, as I say, it was basically another boot camp. And so we went to class during the day, and then we had, there were drills that we went through with them, and then the rifle range, and once we were through with that, why then at the end of our training, which, if I remember correctly, was somewhere around the 1st of January, why then we were transferred to another part of the base.
Now, I've been told that there was a part of the training, if you will, was in fact directed at creating hatred for the enemy, developing little, trying to dehumanize, if you will, the Japanese to a certain extent. Did you encounter any of that?
Not really, or I might say not formally. There was the feeling, of course, since the Japanese had attacked us, that these were not the good guys. And so we did develop an animosity toward them, which increased a little bit more, of course, as you got into the situation of actual battle. There is a little aside there. I had mentioned that my brother was also in service. He was a Marine officer, and at this point he was overseas. Well, the first letter that I received from him when I was at Camp Lejeune, he was chewing me out for volunteering to go to the Marine Corps. And he said, "Didn't Dad and I both tell you don't volunteer for everything?" And so my answer to him was, "Harry, I volunteer the way you usually do in the service." They said, "You will." I did. So that was it. But as far as the animosity and so forth, as I say, it was basically a general feeling. At that time, we of course had no meeting with any of the Japanese, and so all that we knew was what there were some people in the division who had served in earlier battles, because the 5th Division was made up of a number of the people who had survived from the 1st Division and so forth. So they were veterans from that standpoint.
Well, just this whole feeling, this whole idea.
Yeah.
Well, well-behaved people don't shoot corpsmen.
Yeah, we were not too fond of that. So as I say, that was driven home to us very, very quickly. In fact, when we were issued our corpsman's bag, a corpsman had 2 bags that you slung over your shoulders, and inside the top of one of those was this very nice little white brassard with a red cross on it. And our instructions were, now you reach in with 2 fingers, you pick this up, and you walk over to the nearest GI can, and you drop it in. And that was the last that we saw of it. In fact, when we went into combat, no one had any insignia on them. There was a code, we had numbers which identified you as to your rate and also to the unit that you belonged to, but that was all that there was. So we were trying very hard to make sure that people couldn't pick us out that way. That's why you didn't salute anybody when you were in a battle area.
Yeah, unless you didn't like it.
Well, the thought did pass my mind at times.
Okay, well, let's talk about going overseas then, and what that was like. And
Well, we went overseas, I believe, I'm not too great on some dates, but I believe that it was in either August or September of 1944. We had gone through training there at Camp Pendleton. We had done some amphibious landings. We'd been on bivouac, things of that type. And we boarded the ship that was humorously referred to as the Greyhound of the Pacific. It was a merchant marine ship, the John B. Floyd. It took us 8 days from San Diego to Hilo, Hawaii. And so this was our introduction to that. Basically, when you're on a ship like this and it's moving slow, but there's not much to do, they were serving us 2 meals a day, saltwater showers. And so we found ways to eat raw carrots that were stored on the deck in boxes. They were accidentally broken open. And I think we also ate some onions. But we were hungry. You have to remember that probably the average age was somewhere between 18 and 19 years of age. And so 2 meals a day didn't exactly fit.
in Hawaii, you underwent some more extensive training?
Hawaii, we went we landed in Hilo, and at that time there was a narrow gauge railway which was also used by the sugar industry, and we rode that up to a little town called Hanakau, and then from there we were loaded into trucks and we went to Camp Tarawa, which is about the same altitude as the city of Bend. So we were fairly high up in the mountains, which meant that it got very cold at night. Could be hot in the day. As we used to say, the wind is blowing dust in your face, it's raining, and the sun is shining, all at the same time. But while we were there, we did receive more training. The doctor who was my commanding officer, Dr. Larson, who was lieutenant commander, had a program. He was a surgeon, and he had a program to train our surgeons and also to train us. What he had done, he had gone to some people don't like this idea, but he had gone to a nearby slaughterhouse, and he would have the animal intestines brought, and then they would be placed on an operating table, and the doctor, the surgeon, plus the corpsman would be there, and we would perform the various operations that he would prescribe. And so this was a continuation of that. So the one thing that I had omitted in talking about being in California. Originally, I was supposed to be in what they call a collecting section. Those were the people who were up near the front lines and brought the wounded in. But the day that we were supposed to be issued our sidearm, which was a .45, I was told, don't report over there today, report to surgery. So that was my introduction. I still to this day don't know how or why this happened, but it was the first time I'd ever been in an operating room other than when I had my tonsils taken out. And so it was basically it's on-the-job training. My first surgery, we were operating on a man who had hemorrhoids, and they were using an intravenous anesthesia. Well, he wasn't quite all the way under. And so I'm standing there with my left hand firmly planted on his rear, trying to hold him down so that the doctor can perform the operation, and then passing instruments and threading needles and so forth with the other side. So, but that was, and then we gave shots and various things like that. So we served in a dispensary on the base. Every company had to serve for a period of time. But then when we got to Hawaii, plus our other training, we also, each company went to a Army hospital that was in a small town there, just like, oh, you might say from here to Springfield. And we were in there, and then we were to receive training. And I remember that I had, part of my training was the first time I'd ever seen an appendectomy, I was standing there and handing out instruments. Well, when it was over, the nurse, who was about 5 feet nothing, came up to me as I turned around, and she started telling me what I had done wrong. And so then she told me, take your gown off, leave your gloves on, you're going to do a 5-minute scrub, and you will be back in here and you will do another operation, which I did. Evidently, the second time around, I did it correctly because I didn't get the finger in my face and the instructions as to how to do it better. But we were there to have really more actual surgical training, because in a dispensary, you don't have too many things of that type that occur. Anything that is serious went on to the base hospital. But we were the base hospital in that area.
Okay, sounds good. So let's talk about shipping out to go to Iwo Jima.
Well, it was kind of an odd situation. We were still at the hospital. We had been there through Christmas and the first of the year. And as the military would do it, I think it was somewhere around 11:30 or 12 o'clock at night, where suddenly somebody came into this ward tent where we were sleeping, turned the lights on, and proceeded to tell us to take down our cots, fold them up, put them in the corner, get our gear together, you're moving out. And so we did. And it was dark when we got outside and the company assembled, and we marched down to what I later found out was the area where the 28th Marines were located. That was the unit that our company was assigned to. Each company in the battalion had been assigned, or 3 of them had been assigned Marine regiments, and they were to be their hospital. That was the original plan. But Iwo Jima is a little small, so we didn't have room for that many hospitals. But we went from there, boarded ship in Hilo, went to, we went up, and the ship stopped just off Maui, and they had a mock landing. This was the battalion aid men, the different crews that went ashore, plus the Marines, went ashore, and then they came back on, and then we proceeded on to Pearl Harbor. And we were there for about a week for the rest of that part of the convoy to form up. In the meantime, when you had time off, there was a big park that they would drive us over to, and you could swim or you'd play ball and just general goof off. And then finally they got us all together and we shipped out. The next time we saw dry land was Eniwetok, which is a far, far place out there. I figured it out one time. I think we were aboard ship for at least a month before we put foot on dry land. So we saw a lot of the Pacific Ocean. But I remember that we also stopped at Kwajalein, and this was where the rest of the convoy formed up. And as far as the eye could see, there were ships all over the place. And then we proceeded on from there to Saipan. And at Saipan, why we had to, I remember the operating room crew, 3 of us had to go over to another ship to pick up some of our supplies that were on there. And so I always felt sorry for Zafuto. That was the name of the pharmacist mate who was in charge. He was the only one who was really trained to be an operating room technician. But poor Zaf got seasick because there was a horrible swell off Saipan. And so we'd be up, one minute we'd be up level with the deck, and the next minute we would be below the water line. And so we finally got everything off. But then when we came back to our ship and we're going to transfer the gear back, we put that into a cargo net that they had. And then the last thing we put in the cargo net was a Fudo, because he was incapable of making any movement of his own. He was about a little bit about the color of your shirt. And he was an Italian, and he had the black curly hair, and as the saying goes, he looked a mess, and he just lay there and that was all he could do. But then at that point, I think we were about 2 days away from Iwo Jima. And we arrived at Iwo during the night, so didn't see anything until the following day.
Well, tell me about your first impression. The sun comes up and holy cow, look at what's
Well, the sun came up. We went out on deck. It was awfully noisy. And, of course, the reason for that was the fact that we were out at about the same distance from shore as battleships and cruisers. And so I remember there was one battleship out there and firing the 16-inchers. And after a while, you got to the point where you could follow the flight of the shell going in. And so this was happening. And then we started noticing that there were a number of ships or boats coming out to us. I remember there was one LCVP that came out, and it had burned to the water's edge as we were watching it, and that somebody had been over there and had picked them up. And then there was an LCI that came out that was down at the bow. It had received an artillery shell somewhere in the forward section, and it was in the process of sinking. But at this point, it became very, very evident that we were going to be busy. And so I was assigned to a Dr. Heidelberg to do what is now called triage. Nobody mentioned the word that I can recall, but we were taking the wounded as they were brought to the ship. They would be brought out by either a landing craft or an LSG. They would then be hoisted aboard, and still on the stretcher, what they had done, they had cleared out the officers' wardroom, a dining area, and then these stretchers would be put there. We would go over to the person. The doctor would read the label that they had put on him, and then we would check the wound, and 9 times out of 10, we, of course, were changing the bandages. And so I had a large container of bandages and a very handy pair of bandage scissors. I became quite good at taking a pant leg off or a sleeve or anything of that type, because we had to get to the wound very quickly. And so once we had done that, then they would be sent either to surgery or they would be sent into another part of the ship where they would be, it was converted into a hospital.
And you were pretty busy that first day then?
We were busy for, I would say, at least 2, perhaps 3 days. We did not go ashore until after the flag had gone up. And
Good. Let's change tapes. Well, let's talk about the flag going up. Are you too busy to see it, or?
actually, I didn't see it go up. Of course, by this time we had moved in a little closer. But the word came out, and where we were receiving the wounded was on the starboard side, and this was Suribachi was on the port side. So, as people have said, it's a wonder that all the ships didn't capsize because everybody was rushing over to that side. And I remember there was an officer standing there with field glasses around his neck, and I don't believe I said, "May I use your field glasses, sir?" But I did get a good view of the flag. It was up there. What you could see, of course, was this, at that distance, a very tiny fluttering of the red and the white up there above the smoke of the battle there. There's one little item you're asking about how long we were there that I don't think to this day has ever been explained. But somewhere in I think it was late in the first day on D-Day, that there was a message that came from the shore to the ship, and they asked that some 20 to 25 corpsmen replacements be sent in. And no one has ever been able to find out, or at that time was able to find out, where the order came from, but 20 or 25 of the corpsmen who were still aboard the ship, they were hospital crew, and they went ashore. So, and as far as I know, all of them survived, but it was just one of those cases of the message came out of the blue, and you don't argue, you just say, get your gear, line up over here, and go down the cargo net. So, but we went ashore, I think it was the day after the flag went up, and we were loaded onto an LST, and then they started for the shore. It was rather late in the afternoon, and I remember that they said, "Well, we won't be able to put you ashore tonight." And as we were laying offshore there, why, there was a sound which later became quite familiar. It was an artillery shell going overhead, and it was coming from the Japanese end of the island, and it hit the ocean, probably about 200 yards beyond where we were, which was quite a welcoming. And so that woke us up. But then as the evening went on, well, there was a condition red, which means enemy planes approaching. Well, at that particular time, another fellow and I had gone below deck looking for some coffee because we hadn't had anything to eat since fairly early that day. And as we were standing there, well, you could look down into the hold of the LST, which is basically just a large area. And so I turned to one of the sailors who were on there. I says, "By the way, what's your cargo here?" "Aviation gas and artillery shells." There were enemy planes approaching. "So what are you going to do?" No, we went back out on the deck and went to sleep. There wasn't anything we could do about it. The next morning they landed us. And I think we were a rather comical sight when we went ashore, because we had not been on solid ground for about 6 weeks. And I can still remember I was trying to adjust to the movement of the ship, but there wasn't any ship around us. The first thing that I did see, though, which brought home exactly how bad things were, other than the debris that we'd seen around the landing area, was a duck, the amphibious truck. It evidently had received a direct hit, was totally burned, and the driver was still in it. And so we marched by that as we were going up to what would be our bivouac area. And so they weren't ready for us to start working on the hospital at that point. So we went over and were looking for an area to dig some holes. There was one thing that was a little funny about that. There was one little Marine. And so help me, every time this guy started to dig a foxhole, he found a landmine. And so we all stayed very far away from him. And the landmines he found were this big. I think they were the anti-tank mines. So finally he did find a place where he could dig a foxhole and there weren't any landmines. But what we did, we dug 2 manholes, put whatever we could over the top of it, covered it, and then left a space, of course, for your feet. And then on the inside, you had your weapon and so forth. But that's where I lived for about 4 or 5 days. I did get to the top of Suribachi, though.
Really?
Yeah. Another corpsman and I, we were more or less relieved of duty. And so we started wandering around, which is not a smart thing to do. But of course, I'm 19 years old. I have never been in a situation like this. But Cart and I started looking around, and we saw our first Japanese. He evidently had been hit by artillery because the lower half of his body was missing. And we continued on over to Suribachi, and it was a rough climb getting up there. And we stood up there. There was the second flag was up by that time. And there was an artillery officer up there with some of the biggest field glasses I have ever seen. And he was calling in artillery on the other end of the island. And then Cart and I wandered around, as you do, and we started down the seaward side of Suribachi. Not a smart move, because we got about 2/3 of the way down, and we ran out of trail. And so we had to literally slide, grab, whatever you could do, down the face of the rocks until we got down to the beach area. And then we walked around the end of that. And at this particular point, we were greeted by a Marine who very quietly but very firmly told us, walk straight toward me, which we did. And then when we got to him, after casting some doubts as to our parentage, etc., he informed us that we had just walked through a minefield. It still gives me a little spooky feeling about that. But then we very quickly went back over to our area, and shortly after that, we started doing the hospital work. The bulldozer came in, would scoop out the loosed sand, and then we would build, as you had mentioned, we would fill sandbags and put those around for fragments, and then we put up ward tents. And then one of the last things that we did was that we put up a portable operating room. It was made of sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, and it was all supposed to fit together. Well, it did until we started putting the roof on. It was designed to be on a level space. There were no level spaces. So we had a large opening on one side, and we looked around and we found a tent that wasn't being used. And so we threw that over the top, and so that kept us safe because we were the night crew, and we were there. You didn't want any light showing.
Well, how was the workload then?
Pardon?
Once you got the hospital up and running there ashore, what was the workload like?
Well, as I say, we were the night crew. Actually, people have asked me about things during the daytime, and I'm rather vague about them because I didn't see too much of the days after we started working there in the operating room, because we were on from 7 at night until 7 in the morning. And once you were in the operating room, you didn't leave until you were relieved. And so we were getting a succession of, various types of wounds. The one thing that I do recall is that the first time in my life that I ever saw an amputation, I was holding on to the leg that they were amputating. And so I'm standing here like this holding it, and the doctor has cut down and is about to saw through the bone. And then, of course, once we we do that, well, then you have to tie off the veins and so forth in the artery. And at this particular point, something odd happened. I was holding it so that he could do this, and he pricked my glove with a needle. Well, I'm contaminated. So I called to the circulating nurse. I said, Ed, I need another glove. Well, he brought over one. I put it on, and it didn't feel right, but kept working. Then when we got through, and I finally peeled it off, and my hand was about the color of your socks, because on a size 9 glove that I normally wore, I had a size 6. And so I virtually had a tourniquet on my hand. But this was, whatever they had, this is what we did. There were abdominal injuries. There were some that were, in a sense, fairly minor, and a number of those we did. The doctor would look at it, and then he would say, well, you know what to do, and so you would do the surgery yourself. He was there if needed, but we had no problem like that.
How do you cope with this? I mean, night after night, in your case, how do you cope with this?
My wife has asked me this, too, because, well, she is a nurse. I'm the one who did all of the first aid for the family. And she says, how can you do this? She said, I get nervous. Well, it was, I know, it's kind of odd. I can't really explain it, but it's as though I had, in a sense, detached myself. I focused on what I was doing, and then when I was through with that, when something else came up, and I would pass on to that. Later you start thinking about it, but at the time you don't have the luxury of doing that. As I say, and I was 19 when I landed on the island. I was 20 when I left, because I had my 20th birthday there, and that was just the way that it was. One thing, we did treat 2 Japanese prisoners. One had a deep wound in the back of his neck, and other than that, he was capable of moving and so forth. And the other one had been hit by a flamethrower, and so we used a lot of Vaseline gauze on him. But Dr. Lehman had been wounded and was in the same tent, ward tent, where they brought this fellow. And of course there was a sentry there to guard him. You wouldn't think that he'd be able to do anything the way he was. They were giving him fluids and so forth. Well, during the night he tried to grab the sentry's carbine and wound up getting shot. And so that was one prisoner that didn't survive. But it was, it was just, as I say, usually we would be extremely busy until about 3 or 4 in the morning. And by that time, things would be slacking off, but we'd still get people who were, when they could, wounded at night, where they would bring them
in. I've heard that the guys that had to go out after the wounded had a rough time. That
yes.
Stretcher bearers in particular were
right.
Big targets. So is that something that you could talk about? I realize you weren't out there, but...
Well, I have, as I say, I have some friends, 2 of them that I write to, who were doing this, and one of them was wounded. In fact, he still has some problems with his leg from that wound. But it was you were literally a target out there. And one of the things that they were starting to do near the very end, as I recall, was that the Japanese started looking at the Marines, we will say, were out there, and they figured out that anyone who was carrying a .45 on their hip was either an officer, a non-commissioned officer, or a corpsman. And so some of these guys started rigging up shoulder holsters, but a number of them also picked up the M1s and the carbines and so forth, so that they looked basically like anyone else. we only had one situation from our company where someone, we might say, failed to do his duty. He was sent up as a replacement from the hospital, and when he was supposed to go out and help pick up the wounded, he wouldn't get out of his foxhole. So he was the NCO in charge had shipped him back with a warning: if don't send him back, because if the Japanese don't shoot him, we will. He just got out there and he was scared, which of course would be a good possibility, but he made no effort other than that. But that's the only case that I heard of anyone who had a problem that way. We did have a number of them who were killed, including the fellow that climbed Suribachi with me, and he was, oddly enough, he was killed while he'd very carefully gone out to where this person was, who he thought was wounded, and they said that just as he reached up to touch him, there was a sniper who had him zeroed in, and he had one of those light machine guns and fired 4 shots, and it killed him. So, and that happened on a number of occasions. While trying to take care of the wounded, of course, they were also hit.
Not an easy job.
No, it's there was one sidelight on that. The lieutenant colonel who was in charge of the battalion that went up to put the flag on top of Suribachi, Chandler Johnson, no relation as far as I know, but somebody came back to the collecting section and they said, we need some corpsmen up here. An officer has been hit. So he said, well, we go galloping up there and we think, well, okay, well, it's not bad. He says, maybe even somebody might take notice of what we're doing. Well, he said when they got up there, of course, there wasn't much left of the colonel to find, because the artillery shell or mortar shell, whatever it was, had literally landed between his legs, and that his rib cage was about all that was left, plus I think his arm with the watch on it. But he had just disappeared. So.
Yeah, we go back to question A, how do you cope with this kind of stuff? I mean, good grief.
Well, coping, as I say, I didn't seem to have a problem with it. As I say, it's as though I, in a sense, could detach myself at times. And I know that there were some people that had a great deal of difficulty with this. But our job, as I say, was we took care of the people who came in. They kept coming in. There were times that you would have an opportunity to talk to one of the patients before you were operating on them. And at a time like that, you would have this feeling of identifying with them. And I know there were other times that we couldn't cope with one of the doctors that we had. There was a patient who came in who had stepped on a landmine and had lost both legs, lost both of his feet and the lower part of his legs. And as soon as the operation was over, the doctor came down, knelt beside the stretcher where they were waiting to take him out, made sure that he was awake, and his words were, "Sorry, son, but we had to take your legs off." Not what I was taught in patient care. He also had bet a fifth of whiskey with somebody else that this guy would survive, so they were betting on the outcome. As I say, he was not one of our favorite surgeons, but we had to work with him. So that sort of thing, I think, got to me more than the other. It was just, as I say, it just became something that it was a repetition. And later, you started thinking about it and various people and so on.
I would think the hardest thing in that line of work that you were doing would be to lose somebody on the table. So.
We never did, which is, we never lost one patient on the table in the 20 some odd days plus that we were operating. And now, what happened to them once they were into the surgical tent, well, of course, we didn't know. And for the most part, many of them were either flown out the next day to Guam, or while they were still there, they were also taken out to the hospital ship. At one time, there were 2 hospital ships out there, and so they were taken out there, and they were taken care of. So as I say, I saw some that I wondered if they would survive this, but I have no way of knowing since they were long gone.
Of course, one of the main reasons that we went to Iwo Jima was for the B-29s to have a place to land. You must have been on the island when they brought some of them in. Did you see that? Or?
Actually, the first one that landed on my birthday, March the 4th. But I did not see any of them come into land, but I did see one that was getting ready to take off. And he was at for some reason, I was up. I think we usually would be getting about 4 to 5 hours of sleep once we got to bed. And I was standing there talking to someone, and the plane was at the Suribachi end of the runway and revving up the engines, and then you heard them start, and I was standing there and talking to this fellow, and all of a sudden we heard a loud screech. And we both turned around. The nose wheel of the B-29 had retracted as they were going down the runway. It was nose down. The propellers were all bent like a couple of pretzels, like 4 pretzels. And the fellow that we felt sorry for was a poor tail gunner. He was about 40 feet in the air, and I can still see him. He was able to crawl out, and he was scooching his way down the top of the fuselage so that he could get off of the plane. Now, what they did with it, I don't know, because there were 4 props that had to be replaced, plus the other. But as I say, I don't recall seeing any of them come in, because they usually came in during the day, and by that time I would probably be down in my hole trying to get a few hours of sleep. So
Army fighters, I guess, around quite a bit.
P-51s. There was also one of the night fighters, plane made by Northrop. It was a twin-engine plane and had 20 millimeters, and then it had a battery, I think, of 450s. And they went up, and of course, they were looking for the Japanese using radar. At that time, it was still a plane that had a 3-man crew. One of them was a radar operator, but it was painted a solid black. It had I told my wife, it had a picture of a rather scantily dressed lady leaning up against a lamppost, and the name of the plane was Midnight Madonna.
Any observations about the P-51s, about what they were doing?
Yeah, I can remember that we were in a position at one point where we could see them. Actually, what they were doing, they were providing protection for the B-29s when they went to Japan, because they had legs enough that they could do that. And also, they were doing skip bombing at the north end of the island. We could watch them as they started down in their shallow dive, and then you could see the bomb detach itself, and then of course you would see the dust and the smoke from the explosion. But they said that one of the first P-51s that landed there, they thought that they had cleared all of the debris off of the field. Well, one of the tires hit something, and the tire blew, and the P-51 was literally rolled up into a ball, and so the crew came running out. Everybody was thinking, oh, we have a casualty here. They pried the cockpit open, He had a small cut on his forehead and a sprained ankle. The plane was so solidly built that he was almost completely protected from that. So one of the things that did happen there that was really a lifesaver, literally, was when we started receiving whole blood. And it was, I remember that the bottles of the whole blood would have the person's name on it. And quite a bit of it came from San Francisco. So that really was a godsend. And so we used a great deal of it.
Was that coming in by planes? Or?
Yes. The first that came in actually came in by parachute. They were in large plywood boxes, very, very well padded, and then they also had dry ice in them. So they were coming from Guam, I believe. It had been taken to Guam, and then they were loaded onto usually, well, the Army called them C-47s. I never did figure out what the Navy called them, but it was the old DC-3, and so they were dropping them there. And as I say, that really was a great event for us when we had that, because it gave the patient an added opportunity to survive.
Okay. What else do you recall seeing around the hospital? You know, you have kind of a unique view. Most of the guys you've interviewed were up on the north end of the island fighting in the rocks and stuff. You were kind of back towards the airfield. So.
Well, there's one little item that I did not see it, but I heard about it, and then Craig was talking about this too. It was at the time that he was in the hospital, but one of the Marine members of our company, we had Marines that were to do sentry duty and truck drivers, cooks, etc. He was on guard duty outside the one end of the hospital there, which was right by the airstrip, and there was this kind of a dirt, what you would call a dirt road beside it, and he was standing there on guard duty, and we noticed these 4 people coming up the road. And so he said, I just kind of looked at them. They didn't seem to be too much of a problem. But then, after they passed him, he suddenly realized, hey, these guys have on a different uniform. And so he shouted for them to halt. Well, as soon as he shouted, they started to scatter. They were Japanese. They had come from Suribachi, and they were trying to go to the north end of the island. Well, he opened fire. He killed one, wounded another. No, he wounded 2 of them, and the 4th one got away. Well, at this point, his rifle had jammed. And the next day, when they were talking about it, this was after it happened, they said, well, what did you do when you went back on sentry duty the next night? He said, I had a BAR. And I know I told this to Craig. He said, because he had started the story when I first met him there in Corvallis. He started the story, and I finished it, and I told him the name of the Marine who had done the shooting. But he said he had a good choice when he took that. I'm sure that Craig came in during the day, because I don't remember us treating any head wounds.
Let's see. He says night. As I recall, he talked about getting back to the hospital at night. I'm not sure when he was in the operating room, though. But
yeah.
Anyway, did you see the water point they set up down along the beach? The engineers, the desalination.
I could see it from where we were. These were the Seabees. They were the same people who built the road up to the top of Suribachi that the Japanese had been trying to do for 20 years, and they did it in 3 days. They only lost one bulldozer. He got a little too close to the edge and was able to bail out when the bulldozer went over. But I know Craig said that the last time that he was there, it was quite different. He said they put us on a bus and we ride up to the top of Suribachi on a paved road.
Well, eventually you come off, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
We need to change.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Called Start, but I said something to him about that. I said, Corey, and I said, I have a pack howitzer battery about 50 yards from us, so while I was sleeping or trying to sleep, they'd start laying down a barrage, and you'd start rocking with it, and the sand would come down your face. So I wasn't getting a lot of sleep. And this was a case of, I was just beaten. The surgical tent was right behind our operating room, so that was what happened. I'd asked him if he had an empty cot.
Tell him what happened.
Well, he said that he was watching me as I went down. He says, I was afraid you were going to go to sleep before you got back there, but he said, you got back, and he said you were standing there by the cot, and you were asleep before you hit the cot. I think he said he gave me a little push. I went into the cot. Well, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, I guess it was, I was dead to the world. And they came in and they were going to take the wounded up to the airstrip and fly them out. And so they came to him and they said, okay, anybody else? He says, last one on the left. Well, he forgot to tell them that there's a table. And the guy in front of the table is the last one on the left. I am the last one, really the last one on the left. So he said, I happened to look up, and here they have loaded you onto a stretcher. He says, you're still snoring, didn't make a move. And he said, I yelled at him, I said, hey, put him down. He's just a corpsman sleeping. He said, they threw you onto the cot, and you didn't even stop snoring. So I was really tired, evidently. But I told Virginia, I said, you know, I've often wondered what would have happened if I would have awakened, say, about 200 miles out, and then try to convince the people on the plane, and when we landed, to convince them I am not trying to desert. I was simply tired and I was sleepy, and they picked up the wrong guy.
Well, as close as you were to the airfield, did you hear that last attack against the pilots?
We had gone aboard ship by that time. That happened the evening of the day that we boarded the ship. They brought, we boarded the ship on the other side of the island, and we were on the Cape Johnson, but they brought in landing craft and took us out, and then they would take us aboard ship by using a cargo net. But that happened. The hospital unit was there, and we went out. I think we went out as a group, and then some of the people that I write to now, who were still on the island, they were the ones who were there when that happened. And I remember that Stan, who lives in Connecticut, was telling about a friend of his that he said that while they were there and they were waiting to board the landing craft, that this one fellow happened to stand up and look around like that, and at that point, a sniper got him. So it was supposedly it was secure, but it wasn't. So, but then, the funny thing about it, that and I've mentioned this before, was that I think we were at sea for 4 or 5 days before I noticed that the air had a different smell to it, because we'd been on that island for about 30 days, and of course the smell of dead bodies was all over, and it just as though somebody had wiped it clean. But we went back to Hawaii after that, and basically the same thing. I played some baseball, had a minor back operation, and then I started writing this young lady sitting over here.
Let's talk just a little bit about the occupation of Japan.
Okay.
Talk about going ashore there and the difference.
It was much quieter. We went from there. Of course, I know that I was in the hospital when peace was declared. I went back to my unit, and then when they had decided that we were going to go to Japan, we boarded a ship in Hilo, and we started toward Japan. There was a little hassle with the ship because the skipper of the ship was one of those people who had decided that, as far as he was concerned, the war wasn't over. So we were still traveling under wartime conditions, blackout at night, etc. And one evening, somebody accidentally left the radio open when this officer was calling a GQ, and the commodore of the convoy heard it, and a message was delivered to the captain: knock it off, or you are going to lose your command. The war is over. Turn your lights on. But the only thing that really was a little bit of a problem as we were going to Japan, as we got closer to Japan, they were telling us that we had an opportunity when you were on deck, keep an eye out, because they were afraid that there might be some floating mines, either theirs or ours. But I don't think anybody ever saw any. But when we came into Japan, we had to lay offshore for a little bit, and it gave us an opportunity to see it. But that part of Japan, this is the island of Kyushu, that part of Japan just seems to jump straight up out of the ocean. And the mouth of the harbor at Sasebo is a very narrow mouth, and so we had to wait for a Japanese pilot to take us in. And then once we got in, you could see what used to be most of the city of Sasebo. It was a place where they've also built submarines. And I remember to our right, all that area was burned out. And as we were marching through Sasebo, you could still tell that there were dead that had not been removed from the wreckage. And we had to hike, I think it was about 10 miles or so, out to an old Japanese naval station that was out there. And that was where we were quartered until they sent us to different places to do the occupation. We had one problem, though. Have you ever had fleas? Well, we did too, because the Japanese barracks were loaded with fleas. And so every day they would come in, after we were out of the barracks, they would come in and they would soak everything with DDT, trying to kill the fleas. But you'd see people standing out there, an officer trying to do inspection and so forth, and he would be scratching like this or scratching his leg, and the people in the formation were doing the same thing. But eventually we did get rid of those. But we went from this base up to a town called Fukuoka. It's in the northern part of the island of Kyushu. And we went up to that area, and then when we arrived up there, they took us off on a spur line, and we spent, I think it was 2 nights in a deserted warehouse on a railroad siding. It had an added advantage, well, not an advantage, but had an added feature. Somebody heard noises during the night, and he had a flashlight, and he shining his flashlight up on the rafters, and there were rats up there. They were about the size of cats. So that didn't make us feel too friendly about that. But we were eventually sent out to a little town called Saitozaki. It had been a Japanese seaplane base. And so there was a small hospital, which is what we used while we were there. And I remember that it was a little different for us because those of us who worked in surgery, the floors were tiled, the walls were tiled, and everything was set up so it was very easy to keep it clean. And that's where we did our business from that time on until we left. I did have one night that was one I didn't care for. We had one patient who had been hit by a train. He was a seaman. And then there were 2 soldiers who had been aboard a truck. Japanese trains were running with the blackout lights, and I think they only ran 1 speed, which was as fast as they could. and these two guys were killed. So at midnight, I'm in the back of an ambulance with 3 corpses as we're driving the 14 miles to Sasebo, to Fukuoka. And of course, we have to cross about 4 railroad tracks to get there. We made the trip back and forth without any problem. But it was actually the duty there wasn't too bad, except for quite a period of time we were the only hospital unit available to the military for about, I think there were about 200,000 troops there. We were it. There was an Army hospital unit there. Their equipment wasn't there. In fact, the way that we were able to finally leave Saitozaki was that our commanding officer worked a deal whereby we would transfer all of our surgical equipment, etc., pharmacy equipment, laboratory equipment, to the Army. And so they signed for it. He signed that he had done that. And then we were able to go back down to Ainura, and we were there until we left, oddly enough, on December the 7th, 1945. So it's kind of an odd day.
I had forgotten to ask you about President Roosevelt's death and how that affected you then.
Well, actually, we were aboard ship coming back from Iwo, and just as we were approaching the entrance to Pearl Harbor, the skipper of Cape Johnson, who had a very strong Swedish or Norwegian accent, came on the PA system, and he announced then that they had just received word that President Roosevelt had died, and it was one of the few times that you actually had a very, very quiet ship. And we were, it was dumbfounded. I had known of one other president who was in office while I was alive, but this was the only president that I had ever seen, and like many of the other people. But it was a shock. And as I say, it was very quiet, and people were trying to figure out what to do and who in the name of heaven is Harry Truman and so forth, because we just didn't have that type of information. Mm-hmm. And so that was the way that went.
And when you got out, you made the decision, I guess, to not pursue medicine or to stay in the medical field.
Well, I did go into pre-med, but I soon found out that I did not have that much of the scientific side. And so I was looking for something else to do, naturally, and so I took some tests, and it was sort of a unanimous decision by the University of Oregon and myself that I should try education. And I have not regretted that particular move. My medical background did come in handy. I was a coach, and I also served as a trainer, so I could take care of the bulk of first aid problems that had to be taken care of, including ones in our own home.
Okay. Anything you want to add to this as kind of a for posterity's sake?
For posterity. Well, I think, as the people usually say, it was an experience that you, in a sense, are happy that you had it, but given a choice, you would not want to repeat it. As I say, both my brother and I were in service. He was at a supply depot in the South Pacific for 26 months. And as I'd mentioned before, at that time, things were segregated. He was with a black, as they called them then, black Marine detachment. They were sending supplies to us on Iwo Jima. And he knew where we were going before we did. And he said, my parents would keep writing to him and saying, haven't heard from Bill. Haven't heard from Bill. Any idea? He says, I knew exactly what you were doing, but there was no way I could tell them. And so after that, why, after the word came out that we had, what had happened, why then he was able to tell them, and of course I was able to tell them where we were too. So it's, one of the things I know that my mother had made the comment later that when they were wondering how this was going to affect me, because I had never been under these circumstances. And so she got my first letter. And she said, I turned to Dad, and she said, I said, no problem. He's okay. But just a brief moment on Virginia over here. I had sent a letter to my mother when I was in the hospital. I had said, please, could you send me a picture of snow? I couldn't tell her where I was. I said, I haven't seen any in 2 years. And so she sent me a picture, and she said, here's the only one I could find of snow. I don't know who the girl is. And I said, in my letter I said, I do. Send me an old phone book, please. Because I knew I could find her address in there. We'd gone to high school together. I'd known her since she was 13. And so I started writing to her. The rest is history. We've been married 58 years now. So, and I still have the picture.
Well, congratulations on that, and ma'am, congratulations to you for an endurance contest.
Oh, I learned some things today I didn't know.